Did you know that in 1985, Israel was on the brink of complete economic collapse, with inflation hitting an absolutely insane 445% annually? That means if you bought a loaf of bread for 1 shekel in January, by December that same loaf would cost you over 5 shekels. People were literally rushing to spend their money the moment they received it, because waiting even a few days meant watching their purchasing power evaporate before their eyes. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Israel didn't just stop this hyperinflation. They crushed it in less than 6 months, using one of the most radical and controversial economic plans in modern history. What they did was so extreme that it broke every rule in the traditional economics playbook, yet it worked so perfectly that economists around the world are still studying it today. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about numbers and policy. It's about a nation staring into the economic abyss, making decisions that could have destroyed them completely, and pulling off what many consider the greatest economic turnaround of the 20th century. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they did it, why their method was so dangerous, and why this plan became the blueprint for stopping hyperinflation that countries still use today. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how bad things had gotten in Israel by 1985. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if the money in your bank account could buy the same groceries it could buy yesterday. Imagine businesses having to change their prices multiple times per day just to keep up with the collapsing currency. Imagine workers demanding to be paid daily instead of monthly, because waiting for a monthly paycheck meant receiving money that was worth significantly less than when they earned it. This wasn't some gradual economic decline. This was a full-blown monetary emergency that was destroying the fabric of Israeli society. Store owners were using calculators constantly, not to figure out profits, but just to convert rapidly changing prices. Some businesses started pricing items in US dollars even though it was technically illegal. People were hoarding everything from toilet paper to canned goods because they knew these physical items would hold their value better than Israeli currency. The psychological impact was devastating. Citizens lost faith not just in their money, but in their government's ability to manage the economy. Every day that passed without a solution meant another day closer to complete economic chaos. Some economists were predicting that Israel would need to abandon its currency entirely and adopt the US dollar, essentially admitting defeat and surrendering their monetary sovereignty. Here's what makes this situation even more incredible. This wasn't Israel's first dance with hyperinflation. They had been struggling with high inflation for over a decade. In the 1970s, inflation was already running at troublesome levels, but it kept getting worse. By 1980, it was over 100% annually. By 1983, it had climbed to over 200%. Each time they thought they had it under control, it came roaring back stronger than before. Traditional economic solutions had been tried repeatedly and failed spectacularly. The government had attempted gradual approaches, incremental fixes, and conventional monetary tightening. Nothing worked. In fact, some of their attempted solutions actually made the problem worse by creating uncertainty and confusion in the markets. The Israeli economy was caught in what economists call a hyperinflationary spiral, where rising prices create expectations of even higher prices, which then become self-fulfilling prophecies. But what was really driving this inflation madness? The roots go back to some fundamental problems that had been building for years. Israel's economy was heavily dependent on government spending, partly due to massive defense expenditures that were necessary for national survival. The government was essentially printing money to fund operations, which is Economics 101 for how to create inflation. Add to this wage indexation agreements where salaries automatically increased with inflation, creating a vicious cycle where inflation caused wage increases, which caused more inflation. The exchange rate system was also completely broken. Israel was trying to maintain artificial exchange rates while simultaneously printing money, which is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater while someone else is pumping more air into it. The pressure builds until something explosive happens. Currency speculation was rampant, with people constantly trying to convert shekels into more stable foreign currencies, putting even more downward pressure on the Israeli currency. By early 1985, the situation had reached a critical breaking point. Government finances were in complete disarray. The budget deficit was enormous and growing. International confidence in Israel's ability to manage its economy was at rock bottom. Foreign investors were fleeing. Even Israel's allies were expressing serious concerns about the country's economic stability. This is when something remarkable happened. Instead of continuing with incremental approaches that had repeatedly failed, the Israeli government decided to implement what became known as the Emergency Economic Stabilization Plan, or more commonly, the Shekel Stabilization Plan. What made this plan so radical wasn't just its scope, but its approach. They decided to attack hyperinflation, not gradually, but with overwhelming force all at once. The plan was developed by a small team of economists, led by figures like Michael Bruno, who would later become governor of the Bank of Israel. These weren't theoretical academics working in isolation. They were pragmatic policymakers who understood that conventional wisdom had failed and that desperate times required desperate measures. They studied successful stabilization efforts in other countries, particularly in Latin America. But they also recognized that Israel's situation was unique and required a tailored approach. The core insight behind their plan was this: hyperinflation isn't just an economic problem, it's a psychological problem. People expect prices to rise, so they behave in ways that make prices rise. Breaking hyperinflation requires breaking these expectations suddenly and convincingly. Half measures don't work because they don't convince anyone that the government is serious about stopping inflation. So what exactly did they do? The plan had several components that worked together like a precisely coordinated military operation. First, they implemented an immediate wage and price freeze. Not a gradual reduction, not a target for slower growth, but a complete freeze. Wages couldn't increase, prices couldn't increase. Period. This sounds simple, but implementing it required incredible political courage because it meant telling every business owner and every worker in the country that the rules had completely changed overnight. Simultaneously, they dramatically cut government spending, not by small percentages, but by massive amounts that would have been politically impossible under normal circumstances. They eliminated subsidies, reduced public employment, and slashed government programs. This was economically necessary but socially painful, requiring citizens to accept immediate hardship for the promise of long-term stability. The monetary component was equally dramatic. They immediately stopped printing money to finance government operations. The central bank's printing presses, which had been running overtime to fund government expenditures, were essentially shut down for non-essential purposes. This required the government to balance its budget almost immediately, something that would typically take years to accomplish gradually. Perhaps most importantly, they fixed the exchange rate of the shekel to the US dollar. This wasn't just a policy announcement, it was a promise backed by action. They committed to defending this exchange rate with their foreign currency reserves, essentially betting the country's entire monetary credibility on their ability to maintain this fixed rate. If they failed, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The announcement of this plan created immediate shockwaves through Israeli society. Remember, people had lived with accelerating inflation for over a decade. Suddenly being told that inflation would not just slow down, but stop completely, seemed impossible to many citizens. The initial reaction was skepticism and even panic buying as people rushed to make final purchases before the freeze took effect. But here's where the plan's psychology became brilliant. By implementing all these measures simultaneously and dramatically, they created what economists call a credible commitment. This wasn't another incremental attempt that people could doubt. This was such an extreme response that it convinced markets and citizens that the government was absolutely serious about stopping inflation at any cost. The first few weeks were absolutely critical. Any sign that the government wasn't committed to maintaining the freeze would have caused the entire plan to collapse spectacularly. Government enforcement was strict and immediate. Businesses that tried to raise prices faced serious penalties. The central bank demonstrated its commitment to the fixed exchange rate by intervening heavily in currency markets whenever necessary. What happened next defied the predictions of many economists. Instead of creating economic chaos, the plan worked with stunning effectiveness. Inflation didn't just slow down, it virtually stopped within months. The monthly inflation rate, which had been running at catastrophic levels, dropped to near zero almost immediately. Price stability returned to Israeli markets for the first time in over a decade. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the economic one. Citizens who had been living in constant fear of currency devaluation suddenly found that their money maintained its value from day to day. Businesses could make long-term plans again instead of constantly adjusting for inflation. Workers could accept monthly paychecks without worrying about currency depreciation. The entire economic mentality of the country shifted almost overnight. But this success came with significant costs that are important to understand. The immediate impact on employment was severe. When businesses couldn't raise prices but faced ongoing costs, many were forced to lay off workers. Unemployment rose sharply in the months following the plan's implementation. Many small businesses struggled to survive under the new constraints. The government's spending cuts also created real hardship. Public services were reduced, subsidies for basic necessities were eliminated, and government employment was cut significantly. Citizens faced higher costs for many essential services, while simultaneously dealing with increased unemployment and wage freezes. The social cost of the stabilization was substantial and immediate. However, the architects of the plan had anticipated these short-term costs and calculated that they were necessary to achieve long-term stability. Their bet was that the benefits of stable prices would quickly outweigh the temporary hardships, and they were right. As inflation expectations normalized, businesses regained confidence to invest and hire. Economic activity, which had been distorted by hyperinflation, began to function normally again. International reaction to the plan was initially mixed, but quickly became admiring as the results became clear. Foreign investors, who had been avoiding Israel due to currency instability, began returning. International financial institutions that had been skeptical of Israel's economic management started expressing confidence again. The success of the plan enhanced Israel's international credibility in ways that extended beyond economics. The technical execution of the plan required incredible coordination between different government agencies. The central bank had to work closely with fiscal authorities to ensure that government borrowing didn't undermine monetary stability. Labor unions had to be convinced to accept wage freezes in exchange for price stability. Business organizations had to be persuaded that temporary profit constraints were worth long-term stability. One of the most impressive aspects of the plan was how it dealt with the indexation problem. Many contracts in Israel were indexed to inflation, meaning they automatically adjusted for price increases. These agreements had been designed to protect people from inflation, but they were actually helping to perpetuate it by ensuring that wage increases followed price increases, which then led to more price increases. The stabilization plan had to find ways to break these indexation cycles without causing legal chaos. The international economic context also played a crucial role. The mid-1980s were a period when many countries were struggling with inflation, and international institutions like the International Monetary Fund were developing new approaches to stabilization. Israel's plan benefited from international experience while also contributing new insights that would influence future stabilization efforts around the world. As months passed, and the plan's success became undeniable, it began attracting attention from economists and policymakers worldwide. Countries facing similar hyperinflation problems started studying Israel's approach. The plan became a case study in economics textbooks and influenced stabilization efforts in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and other regions facing monetary crises. The long-term economic benefits extended far beyond just stopping inflation. With price stability restored, Israeli businesses could engage in long-term planning and investment. The financial sector, which had been distorted by hyperinflation, began functioning normally again. International trade became easier as foreign partners regained confidence in the shekel's stability. Perhaps most importantly, the success of the plan restored public confidence in economic institutions. Citizens who had lost faith in their government's economic management saw concrete proof that effective policy was possible. This restored confidence had positive effects that extended throughout the economy and society. However, maintaining the success of the stabilization plan required ongoing discipline and careful policy management. The government couldn't simply declare victory and return to old habits. They had to maintain fiscal discipline, careful monetary policy, and vigilance against any return of inflationary pressures. This required sustained political will and public support over many years. The plan also had to evolve as economic conditions changed. The rigid wage and price freezes that were necessary for the initial shock treatment couldn't be maintained indefinitely without creating economic distortions. The government had to carefully transition from emergency measures to more sustainable long-term policies, while maintaining the credibility that had made the initial stabilization successful. Looking back from today's perspective, the Shekel Stabilization Plan represents one of the most successful examples of how determined government action can solve even the most severe economic crises. It demonstrated that hyperinflation, while devastating, isn't an unsolvable problem if policymakers are willing to take sufficiently dramatic action and maintain credibility through consistent implementation. The lessons from Israel's experience have influenced economic policy around the world. The importance of credible commitment, the need for comprehensive rather than partial measures, and the critical role of psychology in economic stabilization have all become recognized principles in modern economics. Countries facing similar crises have drawn on Israel's example, though each situation requires adaptation to local conditions and circumstances. What makes this story even more remarkable is that it wasn't just an economic success, but a demonstration of how societies can come together to solve seemingly impossible problems. The Israeli public accepted significant short-term hardship because they were convinced that their leaders had a credible plan for long-term improvement. This kind of social cooperation is often the missing ingredient in failed stabilization attempts. The Shekel Stabilization Plan of 1985 remains a landmark achievement in economic history, proving that even the most severe economic crises can be overcome through bold action, careful planning, and sustained commitment. It transformed Israel from a country on the brink of economic collapse into a stable, modern economy that continues to thrive today. Most importantly, it showed the world that hyperinflation, despite its devastating effects, is not an insurmountable challenge when faced with the right combination of economic knowledge, political courage, and social determination.